Everyone in cell block D thought they knew exactly how this story would end. They saw a new inmate walk into the dining hall. They saw an older black man carrying a plastic tray. They saw a quiet face, tired eyes, and gray hair that seemed out of place among the concrete walls and steel doors of Redstone Correctional Facility. And when the most feared bully in the block stepped directly into his path, every man in that room believed they already knew what was coming next. They were wrong. The dining hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of another afternoon meal. Plastic trays scraped across metal tables. Conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling. Guards stood along the walls, watching hundreds of inmates move through the routine they had repeated countless times before. Outside, the Texas sun beat down on the prison yard, pushing temperatures well past 90 degrees. Inside, the air felt heavy, carrying the scent of overcooked food and old concrete. Near the center of the room sat Travis Cole. Everyone knew his name. Some respected him. Most feared him. He occupied the same table every day, surrounded by a small group of loyal followers who laughed at his jokes and avoided questioning his decisions. For nearly 6 years, Travis had built a reputation that extended far beyond the dining hall. New inmates learned quickly that certain rules existed inside cell block D, and many of those rules belonged to him. On that afternoon, Travis leaned back in his chair, casually scanning the room as inmates filed through the serving line. Then his eyes settled on someone he had never seen before. The newcomer stood alone. No friends. No allies. No visible interest in drawing attention. The man looked to be around 60 years old. His prison uniform hung loosely on his lean frame. His movements appeared calm and deliberate, as if nothing inside the facility could hurry him. He collected his meal without speaking and started toward an empty table near the far corner of the room. Several inmates noticed him. A few exchanged curious glances. New arrivals always attracted attention, but there was something unusual about this one. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem angry either. He simply walked forward with the steady pace of someone who had already accepted whatever waited ahead. His name was Malcolm Hayes. Most of the men in the room had never heard it before. Travis rose from his chair. The sound alone was enough to make nearby conversations fade. A few inmates lowered their eyes. Others subtly turned their attention toward the developing situation. They had witnessed scenes like this many times before. The pattern rarely changed. Travis took a few slow steps forward and positioned himself directly in Malcolm's path. The older man stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. The dining hall seemed quieter than before. Not silent, but quieter, as though the room itself had become curious. Travis smirked. His followers watched closely from their table. A guard near the wall glanced over, but remained where he was. Malcolm simply stood there holding his tray. His expression never changed. His shoulders remained relaxed. His breathing steady. There was no sign of fear. No sign of challenge. Just stillness. The kind of stillness people often overlook until much later. Around them, dozens of inmates paused their conversations. Some expected an argument. Others anticipated embarrassment. Everyone expected a reaction. Instead, Malcolm calmly lifted his eyes and looked directly at the man blocking his path. The moment lasted only seconds, but something about it felt different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just different. Somewhere near the back of the room, an older inmate stopped chewing and stared. Another man quietly lowered his fork. Neither could explain why. They only felt an unexpected tension settling into the atmosphere. Travis seemed amused. Malcolm seemed unchanged. And while nobody realized it yet, the next few minutes would become one of the most talked about moments in the history of Cell Block D. The smirk on Travis Cole's face widened when Malcolm Hayes failed to respond. Most men who entered Cell Block D made one of two mistakes. They either tried too hard to appear tough, or they immediately showed fear. Travis had spent years reading those reactions. He understood insecurity. He understood pride. He understood desperation. What he did not understand was silence. Malcolm stood there holding his tray as though the crowded dining hall had disappeared. The older man neither stepped back nor attempted to move forward. He simply waited. The expression on his face remained calm, almost thoughtful. It was not the look of someone intimidated. It was not the look of someone preparing for confrontation either. If anything, Malcolm looked like a man studying a problem whose answer already existed. Travis glanced over his shoulder toward his followers. A few of them chuckled. expecting the usual routine to unfold. Yet something felt off. The laughter lacked confidence. It came a little slower than normal. Around the room, conversations continued to fade. Even inmates who normally ignored trouble were paying attention now. Malcolm's silence was creating questions nobody could answer. Travis leaned slightly closer. "You got a name?" he asked. Malcolm looked directly at him. "Malcolm." His voice was steady and quiet. No anger, no fear, just a simple answer. Travis waited. Most newcomers immediately followed their name with explanations, apologies, or attempts at respect. Malcolm offered none of those things. The older man simply stood there. Another strange silence settled between them. Somewhere near the serving line, a younger inmate whispered to his friend. Neither took their eyes off the scene. The guards along the wall remained watchful but relaxed. As far as they could tell, nothing serious was happening. Yet one officer found himself paying closer attention than before. There was something unusual about Malcolm's posture. The man carried himself differently from most inmates his age. Years inside prison often left people tense. Their shoulders tightened. Their movements became guarded. Malcolm appeared relaxed, but not careless. Every movement seemed measured. Every glance seemed intentional. Travis folded his arms. "You know who I am?" Malcolm nodded once. "I heard your name." The answer should have satisfied Travis. Instead, it irritated him. He was used to hearing recognition mixed with nervousness. He was used to seeing people adjust their behavior the moment they learned who stood before them. Malcolm did neither. The older man remained exactly the same. Calm, patient, unmoved. Across the room, an inmate named Walter Briggs watched from a corner table. Walter had spent 23 years moving through different correctional facilities. He had met athletes, former soldiers, career criminals, and men who could manipulate entire cell blocks with nothing but words. Experience had taught him to notice details others ignored, and one detail immediately bothered him. Malcolm never stopped observing the room. His eyes moved naturally from exit to exit, from guard station to guard station, from table to table. Not obviously, not enough for most people to notice. But Walter noticed. The pattern reminded him of someone. He just could not remember who. Travis took another step. "You must not understand how things work around here." Malcolm listened without interrupting. "Maybe not," he said. The answer sounded sincere. Yet somehow it carried a strange weight. Travis narrowed his eyes. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by confidence. Still, the feeling lingered. The dining hall remained unusually quiet. Malcolm Hayes had spoken fewer than 10 words since entering the room. Yet somehow he now held the attention of nearly everyone present. And although nobody could explain why, more than a few inmates had begun to suspect that the quiet newcomer was not nearly as ordinary as he appeared. Most men would have mistaken the atmosphere in the dining hall for ordinary prison tension. They would have seen a powerful inmate testing a newcomer. They would have seen another small struggle for status inside a place built on invisible hierarchies. But Walter Briggs knew better. The longer he watched Malcolm Hayes, the more a forgotten memory tugged at the back of his mind. He had seen that kind of composure before. Not in prison, not in gang leaders, not in career criminals. It belonged to a different kind of man entirely. Across the room, Travis Cole was beginning to feel something he disliked. Confusion. Every answer Malcolm gave was respectful. Every movement appeared calm. Yet somehow the older man was refusing to play the role everyone expected. New arrivals usually rushed to explain themselves. They tried to avoid trouble. They looked for allies. Malcolm did none of those things. Instead, he stood in the center of the room as though he had nowhere else to be, as though time itself moved slower around him. Travis forced a laugh and glanced toward his followers. Several joined in. Others hesitated. The hesitation bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Reputation depended on certainty. Certainty depended on control. And for reasons he could not explain, the situation no longer felt completely under his control. Malcolm shifted his tray slightly in his hands. The movement was small, almost invisible. Yet Walter noticed something unusual again. The older man never seemed distracted. His attention remained broad. He was aware of Travis, the guards, the exits, the tables, and the surrounding inmates, all at the same time. Most people focused on whatever stood directly in front of them. Malcolm seemed to focus on everything. A correctional officer named David Mercer watched from the far wall. He had worked inside Redstone Correctional Facility for nearly 11 years. Experience had taught him to identify trouble before it started. Yet he found himself studying Malcolm for a completely different reason. The newcomer did not behave like someone entering prison for the first time. There was no visible anger, no fear, no bitterness. There was only patience. Mercer had seen veterans carry themselves that way. Certain law enforcement professionals, too. People whose confidence came from experience rather than appearance. Travis folded his arms tighter. "You seem pretty comfortable for a new guy," he said. Malcolm met his gaze. "I have learned that worrying rarely improves a situation." The answer drew scattered laughs from nearby tables. Yet the laughter quickly faded. Something about the words sounded genuine. Not rehearsed. Not clever. Simply true. Travis shook his head. "You always talk like that." Malcolm considered the question. "Only when someone asks." A few inmates exchanged glances. Even Mercer fought the urge to smile. The response had not been insulting. It had not been confrontational. Yet somehow Travis appeared less comfortable than before. The balance of the conversation had shifted without anyone understanding exactly how. Walter suddenly sat forward in his chair. The memory finally surfaced. Years earlier, at another facility, he had briefly met a retired military instructor brought in to conduct a specialized training seminar for correctional staff. The man had spoken very little. He had remained calm under pressure. Most importantly, he had carried the same quiet awareness Walter now saw in Malcolm Hayes. Walter could not explain the connection. He only knew his instincts were sounding alarms. Around the dining hall, curiosity continued spreading. More inmates stopped eating. More heads turned toward the center of the room. Even those who disliked Travis sensed something unusual unfolding. It felt less like a confrontation and more like the opening scene of a story nobody fully understood yet. Malcolm remained still. Travis remained standing before him. The noise of the dining hall seemed distant now. And while almost everyone present believed they were watching a powerful man challenge a harmless newcomer, a growing number were beginning to wonder whether they had completely misunderstood who Malcolm Hayes really was. Long before Malcolm Hayes entered Redstone Correctional Facility, Cell Block D had belonged to Travis Cole. Not officially. The prison administration would never have admitted such a thing. On paper, correctional officers maintained order. On paper, rules governed every hallway, every housing unit, every meal. Reality looked different. Over the years, Travis had built something far more powerful than a reputation. He had built predictability. Inmates knew what to expect when they entered Cell Block D. They knew which tables belonged to which groups. They knew which conversations to avoid. They knew which boundaries could not be crossed. Most importantly, they knew Travis always seemed to be standing at the center of it all. New arrivals often learned his name before they learned the names of their cellmates. Some heard stories during intake. Others heard them during transport. By the time they reached the block, many had already decided that staying out of Travis's way was the smartest path forward. That system had worked for years. It worked because people behaved predictably. Fear created predictable behavior. Ambition created predictable behavior. Pride created predictable behavior. Travis understood all three. He could usually identify a person's weaknesses within minutes. A nervous glance, an uncertain voice, a desperate attempt to impress the wrong crowd. Most men revealed themselves quickly. Malcolm Hayes was different. Standing in the dining hall, Travis realized he still knew almost nothing about the newcomer. The discovery irritated him. Across the room, inmates continued watching. Some pretended to eat while secretly following every word. Others openly stared. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Correctional Officer Mercer shifted his weight against the wall. He had witnessed hundreds of confrontations over the years. Yet this one felt unusually quiet. The silence carried more weight than raised voices ever could. Malcolm remained perfectly composed. His tray stayed balanced in his hands. His shoulders remained relaxed. He did not appear interested in winning an argument. He did not appear interested in proving anything at all. The lack of ego confused everyone. Travis finally broke the silence. "You know what happens when people come into my block acting different?" Malcolm considered the question for a moment. "No," he answered calmly. "I suppose I do not." Several inmates exchanged puzzled looks. Once again, the response contained no challenge, no sarcasm, no fear, just honesty. Yet somehow Travis seemed more frustrated than before. Walter Briggs watched carefully from his table. The longer he observed Malcolm, the more convinced he became that something important remained hidden beneath the surface. Experience had taught Walter that confidence came in many forms. Some people displayed it loudly. Others displayed it quietly. The quiet kind was usually more dangerous. Malcolm glanced briefly around the dining hall. Not long enough to appear distracted. Just long enough to take in the room. Walter noticed the movement immediately. So did Officer Mercer. Both men reached the same conclusion without speaking. Malcolm was assessing his environment. Not nervously. Professionally. As though observation had become second nature years ago. Travis followed Malcolm's gaze. For the first time, he seemed aware that other people were paying attention. Dozens of eyes now watched from every corner of the dining hall. What had begun as a simple interaction had transformed into something else entirely. Nobody understood why. They only felt it happening. Malcolm returned his attention to Travis. His expression never changed. His breathing remained slow and steady. The noise of the dining hall seemed distant now, fading beneath the growing sense that an invisible line had been crossed. Somewhere deep inside cell block D, certainty was beginning to crack. And for the first time in years, Travis Cole found himself standing in front of a man he could not read. What nobody in the dining hall realized was that Malcolm Hayes had already become the most discussed man in cell block D, and he had been inside the facility for less than 6 hours. Earlier that morning, before breakfast, before intake processing had fully finished, rumors had already started moving through the prison like electricity through old wiring. Some inmates claimed he was a former truck driver. Others said he had once owned a small business somewhere in Georgia. One man insisted Malcolm had spent years working as a maintenance supervisor for a government contractor. Nobody knew the truth. What made the rumors unusual was that they never seemed to stick. Every story sounded incomplete. Every explanation felt wrong. The uncertainty only made people more curious. Back in the dining hall, Travis could feel that curiosity spreading. It irritated him because attention normally flowed in one direction inside cell block D. Toward him. Yet now dozens of inmates seemed more interested in the quiet newcomer standing in front of him. Travis forced a confident smile. "Let me give you some advice, Malcolm," he said. "Life gets a lot easier around here when people understand where they fit." Malcolm listened carefully. He nodded once. That is true almost everywhere. The answer sounded harmless. Yet once again it left Travis without the reaction he expected. Around the room, several inmates exchanged puzzled glances. Malcolm never argued. He never challenged anyone directly. Somehow he still managed to avoid giving control of the conversation away. Officer Mercer continued watching from the wall. Something about the older inmate reminded him of people he had encountered during specialized security training years earlier. Professionals who remained calm regardless of the situation. People whose confidence came from preparation rather than emotion. Mercer could not explain why the comparison kept returning to his mind. Across the room, Walter Briggs noticed something else. Malcolm had not touched his food once. Most inmates arriving from transfer facilities were hungry. Long transport schedules often disrupted meals. Yet Malcolm appeared completely unconcerned about eating. Instead, he seemed focused on understanding his surroundings. Walter watched the older man study the room without appearing to study it. The behavior felt deliberate, almost practiced. Travis glanced toward his followers. He expected encouragement. Instead, he found uncertainty. Nobody understood Malcolm. That alone made him dangerous in a place built on assumptions. The atmosphere inside the dining hall continued to change. Conversations remained quieter than usual. Men who normally ignored each other now watched from across tables. Even inmates with no connection to Travis found themselves drawn into the moment. It felt as though everyone sensed the same thing. Something important was approaching, even if nobody could identify exactly what it was. Malcolm finally shifted his tray slightly and spoke. "You have a lot of influence here." Travis straightened. The statement sounded respectful. "That is right," he answered. Malcolm nodded again. "Influence is a responsibility." The words landed differently than anything he had said before. Not because they were dramatic, because they sounded sincere. For the first time, several inmates saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Travis's face. It vanished quickly, but not before Walter noticed. Not before Officer Mercer noticed either. Malcolm had not threatened anyone. He had not raised his voice. Yet somehow he had changed the entire energy of the room. Outside the narrow windows, the afternoon sun continued baking the prison yard. Inside cell block D, however, a different kind of pressure was building. And while every inmate believed they were watching Travis Cole evaluate a newcomer, only a few had started asking the question that truly mattered. Who was Malcolm Hayes before he walked through the gates of Redstone Correctional Facility? And why did he seem completely unafraid of a system that intimidated almost everyone else? The truth was that Malcolm Hayes looked exactly like the kind of man people overlooked. At 60 years old, he carried no visible signs of importance. His hair had turned almost completely gray. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. The prison uniform hanging from his shoulders looked slightly too large, making him appear thinner than he really was. Nothing about him suggested power. Nothing about him demanded attention. And yet attention followed him anyway. Earlier that morning, when the transport bus arrived at Redstone Correctional Facility, several inmates waiting near intake had noticed him immediately. Not because he stood out, but because he did not. While other transfers complained about the heat, Malcolm remained silent. While others asked questions about housing assignments and schedules, Malcolm simply listened. One officer later described him as the calmest inmate he had processed in years. Another remembered how Malcolm thanked every staff member who gave him instructions. Small details, ordinary details, yet somehow they remained memorable. Back in the dining hall, Malcolm continued standing across from Travis Cole. Around them, curiosity kept growing. Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair, studying the older man more carefully than ever. The longer he watched, the more contradictions he noticed. Malcolm looked relaxed, but never careless. He appeared friendly, but not vulnerable. He seemed humble, yet completely confident. Walter had spent decades reading people. Malcolm was becoming increasingly difficult to read. Officer Mercer experienced the same problem. Most inmates revealed pieces of themselves through body language. Anxiety showed in restless movements. Pride appeared in posture. Frustration surfaced in facial expressions. Malcolm displayed almost none of those signals. His behavior remained remarkably consistent. It was as though he had spent years mastering control over his emotions. Travis noticed the attention shifting toward Malcolm and felt a growing need to reclaim control of the moment. Cell Block D operated according to expectations. People understood their place because expectations remained predictable. Malcolm's presence was disrupting that balance without even trying. "You seem very comfortable here," Travis said. Malcolm glanced briefly around the room before answering. "Comfort comes from accepting reality." Several inmates frowned. The response sounded more like something a teacher would say than a prisoner. Travis shook his head. "Most people do not talk like that." Malcolm smiled slightly. It was the first hint of a smile anyone had seen from him all afternoon. "Most people have lived different lives." The words settled over the room. Not dramatic, not threatening, yet strangely powerful. Walter immediately noticed something important. Malcolm never bragged about himself. He never hinted at accomplishments. Every answer remained simple. Yet each response suggested a depth nobody could quite measure. The mystery continued growing. Outside the narrow windows, clouds began drifting across the Texas sky, softening the harsh sunlight that had baked the prison yard all afternoon. Inside the dining hall, however, the atmosphere felt sharper than ever. Inmates who normally avoided drama now found themselves invested in every exchange. Questions continued multiplying. Who was Malcolm Hayes before prison? What kind of life produced this level of calm? Why did an older man standing alone seem completely unaffected by the pressure surrounding him? Even Travis appeared to be asking those questions now. For the first time since Malcolm entered the room, Travis was no longer studying a target. He was studying a mystery, and mysteries have a way of becoming far more dangerous than anyone expects. As the minutes passed, small details about Malcolm Hayes began attracting attention from people who normally noticed nothing. The first person to mention it was an inmate named Curtis Bell. Curtis had spent years working in the prison library and possessed the unusual habit of observing people instead of judging them. Earlier that afternoon, while most inmates focused on Malcolm's age and appearance, Curtis noticed something else. Every time Malcolm paused, he naturally positioned himself where he could see the entire room. Not in an obvious way, not like someone expecting danger. It simply seemed to be a habit, a deeply ingrained habit. The observation spread quietly from table to table. Soon others began noticing additional details. Malcolm never fidgeted. He never glanced nervously over his shoulder. He never appeared surprised by sudden noises. Even the loud crash of a dropped tray near the serving line barely caused him to blink. For most people inside Redstone Correctional Facility, life involved constant tension. The environment demanded it. Yet Malcolm moved through that tension as though he had encountered far greater pressures long ago. Officer Mercer continued studying him from across the room. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Nearly 7 years earlier, Mercer had attended a specialized training seminar hosted by a retired instructor who spent hours teaching situational awareness. The instructor had emphasized one lesson above all others. People reveal themselves through habits they do not realize they have. Mercer remembered watching the instructor enter a room. Before speaking to anyone, he had quietly identified exits, sight lines, obstacles, and potential problems. Malcolm displayed that same behavior now. The realization made Mercer increasingly curious. Travis Cole sensed the changing atmosphere, but could not identify the cause. Every conversation seemed to circle back toward Malcolm. Every glance seemed drawn toward him. Worse, the older man appeared completely unaware of the attention, or perhaps completely unconcerned by it. Travis preferred opponents he could predict. Malcolm remained impossible to categorize. "You have not told anyone much about yourself," Travis said. Malcolm looked at him calmly. "There is not much to tell." Several inmates nearby almost laughed. Nobody believed that answer. The mystery surrounding Malcolm had only grown larger with every passing minute. Walter Briggs certainly did not believe it. From his corner table, Walter continued replaying old memories. The more he watched Malcolm, the more convinced he became that the newcomer had spent years in a profession requiring discipline. Maybe military service. Maybe law enforcement. Maybe something else entirely. Whatever it was, traces of it remained visible in everything Malcolm did. The older man shifted his weight slightly. The movement lasted less than a second. Yet Walter immediately noticed how balanced he remained. Nothing about him seemed accidental. Nothing seemed rushed. Even standing still looked practiced. Outside, dark clouds continued gathering above the prison grounds. The sunlight faded behind a layer of gray, casting softer shadows through the narrow dining hall windows. Inside, the atmosphere felt increasingly focused. Conversations elsewhere in the room resumed occasionally, only to fade again as attention drifted back toward Malcolm and Travis. It felt as though the entire block was waiting for something. Not a confrontation, not an argument. Something else. A revelation, perhaps. A missing piece of a puzzle nobody could solve. Malcolm finally looked around the room once more. His eyes briefly settled on different tables, different faces, different corners of the dining hall. Then he returned his attention to Travis. His expression remained unchanged. Calm, patient, thoughtful. And in that moment, several inmates experienced the same unsettling realization. The quiet newcomer did not look like a man trying to survive prison. He looked like a man who had already survived far more than anyone there could imagine. Among the dozens of men watching from scattered tables, only one believed he might have seen Malcolm Hayes before. The thought came to him suddenly and refused to leave. His name was Raymond Foster, a quiet inmate who rarely involved himself in prison politics. Most people barely noticed him. That was exactly how Raymond preferred it. Years of keeping his head down had taught him the value of observation. Now, as he stared across the dining hall, an old memory kept resurfacing. It was not a clear memory, more like fragments of a photograph damaged by time. A training facility, a newspaper article, a group of uniformed men standing beside an older instructor whose name Raymond could no longer remember. The image felt frustratingly close. He studied Malcolm more carefully. The gray hair, the calm expression, the steady posture. Something seemed familiar, yet he could not explain why. Across the room, Travis Cole continued searching for a weakness that never appeared. Every person he had ever dealt with eventually revealed one. Pride, fear, anger, impatience. Malcolm displayed none of them. The older man remained composed beneath the attention of an entire dining hall. It was almost as though he had forgotten that everyone was watching. Officer Mercer noticed Raymond staring and followed his gaze back toward Malcolm. The correctional officer felt the same curiosity spreading through the room. Nobody understood the newcomer. That uncertainty had become its own form of gravity, pulling attention from every corner of cell block D. The strangest part was that Malcolm never attempted to create the mystery. He answered questions directly. He spoke politely. He remained respectful. Yet every answer somehow generated even more questions. Travis finally asked the one thing everyone wanted to know. What did you do before all this? The dining hall grew noticeably quieter. Even men pretending not to listen suddenly became very interested in their meals. Malcolm looked down at his tray for a moment before answering. I spent many years teaching. Several inmates exchanged confused looks. That was it. No dramatic story. No impressive title. No explanation. Just teaching. Travis frowned. Teaching what? Malcolm's expression remained calm. Different things at different times. The answer immediately frustrated half the room. Yet Raymond felt a chill run through him. Another piece of the forgotten memory clicked into place. The article. It had mentioned instruction, training, leadership. He could almost see the faded headline in his mind, but the details remained frustratingly out of reach. Walter Briggs noticed Raymond's reaction. He noticed everything. Years in prison had sharpened his instincts. When Raymond suddenly sat forward, Walter knew something had changed. The question was what? Outside, distant thunder rolled across the Texas sky. The sound was faint but noticeable. Dark clouds now covered most of the afternoon sun, casting the prison yard in shades of gray. Inside the dining hall, the atmosphere felt equally unsettled. Travis folded his arms. You must have taught something important. Malcolm considered the statement. For the first time, his eyes seemed to drift somewhere far away. Not toward the room. Not toward Travis. Toward a memory. Sometimes, he said quietly, the most important lessons are the ones people do not appreciate until much later. The words settled over the room like a weight. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Even Travis seemed unsure how to respond. Raymond stared at Malcolm in disbelief. The voice, the phrasing, the calm certainty. Suddenly, another fragment surfaced. Years ago, before prison, Raymond had watched a television interview featuring a respected instructor known for training elite professionals. He could not remember the man's full name. He could not remember where the interview took place. But he remembered one thing clearly. The instructor had spoken exactly like that. Slowly, thoughtfully, as though every sentence had already survived years of reflection. Raymond's pulse quickened. He still lacked proof. He still lacked certainty. But for the first time, he began to suspect that Malcolm Hayes was not simply hiding a past. He was hiding a reputation. The uncertainty hanging over the dining hall should have faded by now. In most situations, curiosity eventually gives way to routine. Meals end. Conversations move on. People lose interest. Yet the opposite was happening. Every passing minute seemed to pull more attention toward Malcolm Hayes. Travis Cole felt it. His followers felt it. Even the correctional officers could sense the unusual shift in atmosphere. For years, Travis had controlled the rhythm of cell block D. If he wanted attention, he received it. If he wanted silence, people became quiet. Yet somehow an older inmate who had arrived only hours earlier was changing the mood of the entire block without making any effort at all. That realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He glanced around the room and noticed dozens of eyes fixed on the scene. Some inmates leaned forward slightly. Others pretended to focus on their meals while listening to every word. The dining hall no longer felt like a cafeteria. It felt like a room waiting for an answer. Travis forced another smile. You know what your problem is? He asked. Malcolm looked at him calmly. No. The answer came without hesitation, without defensiveness, without curiosity. Travis shook his head. You act like none of this matters. Malcolm considered the statement. Outside, thunder rolled again across the darkening Texas sky. The sound echoed faintly through the narrow windows. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to wait for his response. Everything matters, Malcolm said quietly. The mistake people make is assuming they understand what matters most. The words landed harder than anyone expected, not because they sounded threatening, because they sounded honest. Raymond Foster felt another piece of his memory click into place. Years ago, the man from the television interview had said something remarkably similar. The instructor had spoken about leadership, about discipline, about understanding consequences before they arrive. Raymond still could not remember the name. Yet the similarities continued piling up. Across the room, Walter Briggs noticed Raymond's growing reaction. Walter trusted instincts developed over 23 years behind bars. Raymond was not reacting to a guess anymore. He was reacting to recognition. That fact made Walter even more interested in Malcolm's hidden history. Officer Mercer noticed it too. The correctional officer had started the afternoon watching for trouble. Now he found himself searching for answers. Travis folded his arms and took another step closer. The movement immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. Several conversations stopped completely. A few inmates quietly pushed their trays aside, not because they expected danger, because they sensed the moment was approaching some kind of turning point. Malcolm remained exactly as he had been from the beginning. Calm, patient, unhurried. The consistency itself had become remarkable. Travis studied the older man carefully. For the first time all afternoon, doubt began creeping into his thoughts. Not fear. Not yet. Doubt. The realization that he might not fully understand the person standing before him. In cell block D, uncertainty was rare. Travis had spent years eliminating it. Yet Malcolm seemed built from it. Every answer revealed less than it explained. Every observation created new questions. Outside, rain finally began tapping against the windows. Inside, the dining hall felt smaller than before. More focused, more intense. Raymond stared at Malcolm and felt certainty growing where confusion had once existed. He still lacked the name. He still lacked proof. But he no longer believed Malcolm was an ordinary inmate. Not even close. And as the storm gathered over Redstone Correctional Facility, a growing number of people inside cell block D were beginning to reach the exact same conclusion. The rain outside intensified, streaking across the narrow dining hall windows in long gray lines. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the prison walls, low and distant, like a warning nobody could quite interpret. Inside, the room remained locked on Malcolm Hayes. The attention had become impossible to ignore. Even inmates who normally avoided involvement in anything outside their own routines found themselves listening. Travis Cole noticed it too. Every passing minute seemed to shift the center of gravity farther away from him. That had never happened before. He searched Malcolm's face for irritation, fear, arrogance, anything that might give him an advantage. Instead, he found the same calm expression that had been there from the beginning. It was not confidence in the usual sense. It felt deeper than that, as if the older man had already learned lessons the rest of the room was still struggling to understand. Travis shook his head. You talk like somebody who thinks he has all the answers. Several inmates nodded slightly. The statement sounded reasonable. Malcolm looked toward the rain tapping against the glass before returning his attention to Travis. No, he said quietly. I talk like somebody who spent years learning how many answers he did not have. The response drew silence. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt real. Officer Mercer felt the words settle into the room. He had heard countless inmates try to sound wise over the years. Most failed within seconds. Malcolm never sounded like he was trying to impress anyone. That was what made him different. Walter Briggs noticed the same thing. Every sentence Malcolm spoke seemed connected to experience. Not theory, not performance. Experience. Across the room, Raymond Foster felt his memory pulling closer. The forgotten interview. The respected instructor. The calm voice. The measured words. He still could not find the name, but certainty continued growing. Whoever Malcolm had been before prison, people had listened to him. That much felt obvious now. Travis folded his arms and glanced around the room. He saw something he did not like. Curiosity had turned into respect. Not complete respect. Not yet. But the process had begun. People were no longer watching Malcolm because he was new. They were watching because they sensed there was more to him than anyone understood. The realization created a pressure Travis had not expected. For years, he had controlled situations by understanding the people around him better than they understood themselves. Malcolm represented the first exception he could remember. The older man remained unreadable. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the gray sky. The flash reflected against the windows before disappearing. Nobody looked away. Malcolm shifted his tray slightly. It was the first sign that he might finally move toward a table and end the strange encounter that had consumed the entire dining hall. Yet before he took a step, Travis asked one final question. What is the most important thing you ever learned? The room became still. Even the sound of rain seemed distant for a moment. Malcolm looked at him carefully. His eyes showed neither judgment nor challenge. Only patience. Then he answered. Most people spend their lives trying to prove who they are. The strongest people spend their lives knowing who they are. Nobody spoke after that. The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. Raymond felt a sudden jolt of recognition. Not the name. Not yet. but a certainty. He had heard that exact idea before. Years ago, from someone whose job involved teaching discipline, leadership, and control under pressure. His heart began beating faster. Somewhere inside his memory, the missing pieces were finally beginning to connect. And although nobody in the dining hall realized it yet, the mystery surrounding Malcolm Hayes was closer than ever to being uncovered. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The rain continued tapping against the windows. Thunder drifted across the sky beyond the prison walls. Inside the dining hall, however, the silence felt louder than any storm. Malcolm Hayes finally adjusted his grip on the tray and appeared ready to move on with his meal. That simple action should have ended the encounter. Instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Travis Cole could feel the attention of the room slipping away from him. Not because Malcolm had challenged him. Not because Malcolm had insulted him. The older man had done neither. Yet somehow he had managed to command the respect of an entire dining hall simply by remaining calm. Travis had spent years building influence inside Cell Block D. He knew how quickly authority could grow and how quickly it could disappear. What bothered him most was not Malcolm's words. It was the reaction those words created in everyone else. Around the room, inmates were no longer watching out of curiosity. They were studying Malcolm. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked puzzled. A few seemed impressed despite themselves. Travis noticed every one of those reactions. Across the room, Raymond Foster felt another memory surface. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen the interview. It had aired late one evening nearly a decade earlier. The program featured instructors who trained leadership teams, law enforcement personnel, and specialized professionals. One of the featured guests had been praised for his ability to teach discipline under pressure. Raymond could still remember the host describing him as a man who changed lives without raising his voice. The memory arrived incomplete, but it was enough to send a chill through him. He stared at Malcolm more intensely than ever. Walter Briggs noticed the reaction immediately. "You know something," Walter said quietly from across the table. Raymond hesitated. "Maybe." Walter leaned forward. "About him?" Raymond nodded slowly. "I think I have seen him before." The statement spread no farther than their table, but the significance remained. For the first time, someone inside the dining hall was no longer wondering whether Malcolm had a hidden past. Someone was beginning to suspect exactly what kind of past it might be. Officer Mercer remained near the wall, observing everything. The correctional officer had stopped thinking about potential problems several minutes ago. Instead, he found himself asking the same question everyone else seemed to be asking. Who was this man before prison? The answer felt close now. Close enough to sense. Close enough to almost touch. Yet still hidden behind years of history nobody understood. Malcolm finally took a step. Then another. Calmly. Naturally. He moved toward an empty table near the far side of the room. Nobody blocked his path. Nobody spoke. In fact, something remarkable happened. Several inmates subtly shifted their chairs to create additional space without being asked. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet it revealed how much the atmosphere had changed. Respect was beginning to emerge where suspicion had existed only an hour earlier. Travis watched the older man walk away. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty settled heavily in his thoughts. Malcolm had entered Cell Block D as a stranger. Now he felt like the center of a mystery that was growing larger by the minute. Outside, lightning flashed again beyond the rain-covered windows. Inside, Raymond Foster continued searching through old memories. He still could not remember the name. He still lacked certainty. But one thing had become impossible to ignore. The man sitting quietly across the dining hall was not simply a former teacher. He was someone whose reputation had once reached far beyond prison walls. And sooner or later, that truth was going to reveal itself to everyone. The rain continued falling over Redstone Correctional Facility long after most inmates had returned to their meals. Yet very little attention remained on the food. The real focus of the dining hall sat alone at a small table near the far wall. Malcolm Hayes finally began eating, moving with the same calm patience he had displayed all afternoon. Nothing about him seemed unusual at first glance. An older man, a quiet inmate, a newcomer adjusting to another difficult chapter of life. Yet the longer people watched him, the harder that explanation became to believe. Raymond Foster could no longer ignore the memories surfacing in his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment and searched through years of forgotten images. Then suddenly it happened. The missing piece appeared. Not gradually. Instantly. He remembered the television interview. He remembered the training center. Most importantly, he remembered the name. His eyes opened wide. Across the room sat Malcolm Hayes, a man once known throughout professional training circles as one of the most respected instructors in the country. Years ago, Malcolm had directed leadership and crisis management programs attended by military veterans, law enforcement personnel, emergency response teams, and corporate security specialists. Raymond had not attended those programs himself, but he had seen documentaries, interviews, and articles discussing Malcolm's work. The older man had built a reputation not through publicity, but through results. People listened because his lessons worked. Raymond stared in disbelief. The gray hair and prison uniform had hidden the truth, but the voice remained the same. The calm remained the same. The discipline remained exactly the same. Suddenly, every strange detail made sense. The situational awareness, the emotional control, the patience, none of it was accidental. It was the product of decades spent teaching others how to remain calm under pressure. Raymond looked around the dining hall and realized nobody else had recognized him yet. Not Walter, not Officer Mercer, certainly not Travis Cole. Yet now Raymond understood why Malcolm seemed completely unaffected by the social hierarchy surrounding him. Men like Malcolm did not define themselves through reputation. They defined themselves through character. Across the room, Officer Mercer continued watching. Something about Malcolm's posture triggered another memory. Years earlier, Mercer had attended a regional training conference for correctional staff. One guest speaker had received a standing ovation after delivering a seminar on leadership during crisis situations. Mercer had been a young officer at the time. He barely remembered the presentation itself. But he remembered the speaker, the calm voice, the thoughtful answers, the ability to command a room without raising his volume. Mercer frowned. The realization arrived slowly but powerfully. He knew this man too. Travis remained unaware. Yet even he could feel that something had changed. The uncertainty surrounding Malcolm no longer felt like mystery alone. It felt like significance, as though the answer, whatever it was, carried weight beyond prison walls. Malcolm finished a bite of food and quietly looked out toward the rain-covered windows. His expression revealed nothing. No pride, no frustration, no desire for recognition. The remarkable truth was that he seemed perfectly comfortable remaining anonymous. That quality impressed Raymond more than any accomplishment from the past. Most people spent their lives chasing attention. Malcolm appeared completely indifferent to it. Around the dining hall, conversations slowly resumed. Trays scraped against tables. Voices returned. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of prison life, something fundamental had changed. The man everyone had dismissed as an aging newcomer was no longer simply a stranger. Whether they realized it yet or not, Cell Block D had just welcomed someone whose influence had once extended far beyond these walls. And the full impact of that truth was only beginning to unfold. The storm had passed by evening, leaving the prison grounds wet and quiet beneath the glow of security lights. Inside Cell Block D, however, the effects of the afternoon lingered long after the dining hall emptied. Word traveled quickly through correctional facilities. By the time evening count arrived, dozens of inmates had already heard pieces of the story. A new inmate had arrived. Travis Cole had tried to figure him out. Nobody could. That alone made the story unusual. Malcolm Hayes spent the rest of the day exactly as he had spent every hour before it. Calmly, he followed instructions. He spoke respectfully to staff. He exchanged brief conversations with other inmates when approached. Nothing about his behavior suggested a man interested in attention. Yet attention continued finding him anyway. Raymond Foster sat on the edge of his bunk replaying old memories. The more he remembered, the more certain he became. Years ago, Malcolm Hayes had been known for teaching leaders how to remain steady during moments of uncertainty. Thousands of people had attended his programs. Many credited him with changing the way they approached pressure, responsibility, and decision-making. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same man who once stood before conference rooms filled with professionals now occupied a small prison cell. Yet somehow the prison uniform seemed unable to diminish who he was. Officer Mercer experienced a similar realization while finishing paperwork that evening. Reputation often disappeared the moment people encountered hardship. Character did not. The difference had become impossible to miss. Throughout the day, Malcolm had lost every visible symbol of status. He possessed no title, no office, no audience, no authority. Yet he still carried himself exactly the same way. That observation stayed with Mercer longer than he expected. Across the block, Travis Cole remained unusually quiet. For years he had understood the social structure of cell block D better than anyone. Now he found himself thinking about a man who had never challenged him, never argued with him, and never attempted to compete with him. Somehow that made Malcolm even harder to understand. Before lights out, several inmates noticed something else. Men who rarely spoke to one another had begun discussing Malcolm's words from the dining hall. Conversations about respect replaced conversations about reputation. Questions about character replaced questions about influence. The change was subtle, but it was real. One quiet afternoon had accomplished something nobody expected. It had forced people to reconsider what strength actually looked like. As the facility settled into nighttime silence, Malcolm sat alone for a few minutes and looked through the narrow window of his cell. Beyond the fence line, clouds drifted slowly across a moonlit Texas sky. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, unchanged. He did not know that inmates across the block were discussing him. He did not know that Officer Mercer was reflecting on the lessons of the day. He did not know that Raymond Foster had finally remembered his past. Or perhaps he knew and simply did not care. Because the truth about Malcolm Hayes had never been hidden in a title, a career, or a reputation. It had been visible from the very beginning. In a place where most people measured strength by control, fear, or status, Malcolm carried a different kind of strength entirely. And as Cell Block D would soon discover, that kind of strength has a way of changing everyone around it.